Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a trip back in time to an era when people took their sleep rituals very seriously, and not in the way you might think. We're talking about the Victorian Era, a time when a good night's sleep wasn't just about getting rest. It was a whole experience, something carefully curated to fit into the rigid societal rules of the time. The Victorians had quite the obsession with routine, with decorum, and yes, even with the way they slept. You probably wouldn't last a night in their shoes, but I promise it's going to be a fascinating journey. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and drop a comment with your time zone and location. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorian Era, spanning from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s, was a time when society was rigidly structured, with a firm expectation of behavior, especially when it came to matters of health and etiquette. But sleep? Sleep was sacred. It was viewed not only as a necessity, but also as a social ritual. This wasn't just about turning off the lights and climbing into bed, no. Sleep was a performance, a carefully orchestrated event that was meticulously planned each night to ensure the body received its due rest, and the mind, well, it had the right to wander, but within reason. Can you imagine being a Victorian? No smartphones to scroll through, no late-night Netflix binges, and definitely no using your bedroom as a home office. Nope, bedtime was serious business. And to this day, we look back on some of their practices and can't help but laugh, because they were so far removed from our modern sensibilities. I mean, it's safe to say that if you were alive back then, your idea of unwinding might be a tad complicated. Victorian society was governed by decorum, and the daily activities leading up to bedtime were no exception. A proper evening routine was a thing of art. In the upper echelons of society, the evening began with what could only be described as a pre-bedtime parade. After dinner, the rich would gather around for quiet conversation, often in front of a roaring fire. Candles flickered in the dim light, and people gathered to sip tea, perhaps sharing gossip or, heaven forbid, discussing the state of the nation. No raucous partying here. Everything had to maintain that air of properness. But before you could get to sleep, there was one very important thing to address: your bedroom. And I'm not just talking about how it looked, though naturally it had to look pristine. Victorian bedrooms were often decked out with all sorts of devices meant to help you sleep better. In fact, they had a whole set of sleep-enhancing gadgets, some of which you might find absolutely ridiculous today. Take, for instance, the sleeping mask. No, not the kind you might wear when traveling. These were quite different. The Victorian sleeping mask was more of a tool to block out light. It wasn't about relaxation. It was about ensuring you stayed in complete darkness. And the bed? Oh, it was practically an art piece in itself. Some beds were so high you needed a step stool just to climb in. Imagine that, climbing into your bed like it's a stage in a circus act. And let's not forget the importance of bed linens. A person's social status could be judged by the quality of their sheets. Cotton was nice, but if you really wanted to show off, you went for the silk, or if you were incredibly wealthy, the finest linen that money could buy. But sleep wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was about purity, health, and making sure that no evil spirits got into your dreams. In fact, some people believe that the act of sleeping itself could be a spiritual journey. Yes, that's right. They took the idea of sleep as a ritual quite literally. Many people believe that to sleep properly, they had to cleanse their minds of bad thoughts before bed. Now, doesn't that sound fun? Can you imagine trying to shake off the stresses of your day while also making sure you've gotten rid of any evil thoughts? There were also specific rules about how one should enter the bedroom. Some people swore by a custom where they had to take a bath before bed. Not a quick shower like today. No, they'd immerse themselves in a full-on tub bath to cleanse both their bodies and minds. It was thought that only after such a ritual could a person truly be clean enough for sleep. And let's not forget about the power of scent. It wasn't enough to have fresh sheets or the best mattress in the world. No, a proper night's sleep required the right scent in the air. Lavender, rose water, and jasmine were the go-to choices for creating a calming atmosphere. The fragrance was thought to have soothing properties, helping you drift into sleep like a soft lullaby. Now, I can hear you thinking, okay, but what about the actual act of sleeping? Surely, you didn't need all these complicated rituals to just go to bed, right? Well, here's where it gets interesting. The Victorians had very specific rules about how you should sleep. For starters, they didn't believe in the comfort is key mindset we have today. No fluffy pillows or plush comforters for them. Instead, they were all about posture. Sleeping on your back was the preferred method, with a pillow just small enough to keep your head at a slight angle, but not so large as to be indulgent. The idea was to keep your body in alignment, ensuring your spine stayed as straight as possible. And here's where we really get to the good part. People believed that if you didn't follow these bedtime rituals to the letter, well, your health could suffer. They didn't know about sleep apnea or restless leg syndrome, but they certainly had their theories. Some Victorians believed that improper sleep positions could lead to bad dreams or even nightmares, which was something they seriously feared. And let's not even get started on the importance of sleeping in silence. No music, no background noise, just absolute peaceful quiet. So there you have it. The Victorian bedtime was far from the casual, laid-back process we're familiar with today. But before you get too comfortable, let's move forward and see just how these rituals extended to the dinner table and beyond. Trust me, it gets even weirder from here. Now, as we move on to the next section, dim the lights a little more, and let's continue our journey into the peculiar habits of those who lived over a century ago. Now that we've dipped our toes into the world of Victorian bedtime rituals, it's time to talk about something just as important. How these people approached the art of sleep long before they even got into bed. Yes, I'm talking about the pre-sleep routine. You might think you're the only one who does things like sip a warm cup of tea or scroll through your phone in bed. But let me assure you, the Victorians had their own elaborate pre-sleep customs that could have you looking at your own bedtime habits with a raised eyebrow. Let's start with the most quintessential Victorian sleep ritual, the evening meal. Now, this wasn't a rushed, casual affair like the quick bites most of us grab before bed. Oh no, dinner for the Victorians was an event. It was an opportunity to unwind, yes, but also a time to practice restraint, moderation, and, quite frankly, an opportunity to judge others based on how well they adhered to the proper etiquette. Dinner was often served late, around 7 or 8 p.m., long after most people today have settled into their couches for a Netflix binge. And let's not forget, the dinner table wasn't just about eating. It was about creating an environment conducive to conversation and, naturally, digestion. You see, the Victorians were very particular about what they ate before sleep because they believed that what you consumed could impact your ability to sleep soundly. What did they eat, you ask? Well, it wasn't a big, greasy burger and fries, which, let's be honest, we can all agree would not make for a peaceful slumber. Instead, they ate light meals with carefully selected ingredients. Think about warm broths, mild stews, small portions of roasted meats, and sometimes delicate puddings or custards. Oh, and don't forget the tea, an essential part of any evening ritual. No, this wasn't your standard cup of chamomile or peppermint. No. The Victorians drank what they called digestive teas, designed to help calm the stomach and prepare the body for sleep. It's almost as if they had their own pre-bedtime tea party every night. How charmingly formal. Here's where things start to get a little weird, though. Many Victorians believed that certain foods could bring on dreams, both good and bad. Some even turned to dream-inducing foods like nuts, honey, or a few bites of cheese. Not just any cheese, mind you, but specific types thought to have magical properties. It's like a more refined version of the eat cheese, have weird dreams theory we joke about today. Now, I'm not sure if they had any solid evidence for this, but you have to admit The idea of eating a small plate of cheese to influence your dreams is a little charming in its own way. And then, of course, there was the matter of drink. Tea, again, played a prominent role in the Victorian pre-sleep routine. But they didn't just sip it. No, they practically revere the tea as a necessary aid for sleep. A delicate blend of herbs was thought to soothe the body, calm the mind, and prepare one for the most restful sleep possible. Imagine drinking tea from a fine porcelain cup, sitting by the fire, listening to the crackling wood, and knowing full well that if you didn't follow this tradition, you might just suffer the consequences of poor sleep. Now, let's add a little more flavor to this picture. The Victorians, with all their emphasis on decorum, believed that the mere act of eating and drinking could impact your moral character, your social standing, and your physical well-being. Yes, they truly believed that everything from the food you ate to the way you ate, it was part of your overall health, and not just in the way we think about it today. To them, eating well before bed was like setting the stage for a perfect night's sleep, clean, refined, and orderly. So when they went to bed, they were already preparing themselves to rest with a clear conscience and a healthy body. I don't know about you, but I'd say it sounds like a lot of work just to get to sleep. But we can't forget the more eccentric practices of the time. Some Victorians, particularly those in higher social circles, would engage in a specific ritual before bed that involved restorative baths. This was no quick, lukewarm shower. Oh no, this was a full-on soak in what was called tonic water. The idea was that this bath would cleanse the body of any impurities and refresh the skin, making the sleeper feel like they were beginning their sleep experience with a fresh slate. In fact, some people went to great lengths to get the right water, believing that water from specific sources had special healing properties. There were even places where people would travel to in search of the perfect water to prepare them for a good night's sleep. Now, we might find it a bit extreme today, but it's just another example of how seriously the Victorians took their sleep. If baths and teas weren't your thing, you could always opt for a more spirited ritual, evening prayers. It might sound old-fashioned, but many Victorian families would gather before bed to pray for a peaceful night's rest. This wasn't just about religious devotion, either. The act of praying before sleep was considered a way of purging the mind of any negative thoughts from the day and preparing for a restful sleep free from nightmares. So if you couldn't fall asleep, you could always try saying a little prayer to calm your restless thoughts. And just when you thought they couldn't get any more meticulous about their nighttime routines, let's talk about the importance of a calm mind. A major pre-bed ritual for the Victorians was to avoid exciting or disturbing activities after dinner. This meant no engaging in strenuous conversation, no vigorous exercise, and definitely no disturbing thoughts. The idea was that the mind needed to be at peace before it could properly drift into the realm of sleep. Imagine, for a second, living in a world where your entire evening was focused solely on preparing your body and mind for the sole purpose of having a good night's sleep. We're talking about candles, baths, soothing tea, and carefully chosen foods, all to make sure you drift into a peaceful slumber without a care in the world. So there you have it, the Victorian dinner and pre-sleep ritual, a carefully planned, structured process designed to ensure that when it was time to sleep, you did so in the most refined and peaceful manner possible. It's almost like they had a built-in sleep guarantee, if you ask me. Now, let's move forward and take a look at how they set up their bedrooms for sleep. Trust me, it gets even more interesting when you see just how far the Victorians would go to prepare their environment for the perfect night's rest. Now that we've covered the ritualistic meals and calming pre-sleep routines, let's venture into perhaps the most crucial element of a Victorian night's rest, the bedroom. You might assume that their sleep environment was nothing more than a modest room with a bed and a few chairs. But oh no, the Victorians took their bedroom design and decor to the next level. The bedroom, you see, was the sacred space where the day's stresses were supposed to melt away, so everything had to be just right. But before we dive into the extravagant beds and peculiar accessories, let's start with the basics, the bed itself. Oh, the Victorian bed. If you ever thought your own bed was a bit of a hassle to climb into, you've never seen a Victorian four-poster. These beds were towering structures, often so high off the ground that a step stool was absolutely necessary to reach the top. It's not hard to imagine someone in a silk nightgown trying to gracefully hoist themselves into the bed like they're auditioning for a role in a period drama. And of course, these beds were typically surrounded by heavy draperies, sometimes even thick curtains, designed to shut out the light and create an air of privacy and intimacy. There's something almost theatrical about it, don't you think? Now, let's talk about the mattress. We're not talking about memory foam or anything close to what we know today. No, the mattresses of the Victorian era were often filled with straw, feathers, or a combination of both. That's right, straw. These mattresses were stuffed with materials that were surprisingly lumpy, and they didn't offer much in the way of cushioning. But here's the thing, the Victorians didn't mind. In fact, they preferred a firmer mattress, believing that it was better for the spine and would encourage a healthier, more restorative sleep. So if you've ever woken up with a stiff back, you can at least be thankful you don't have to sleep on straw. You might be wondering by now, okay, so the bed was high, uncomfortable, and possibly a little bit dramatic. But what about the rest of the room? Well, as you might have guessed, the Victorian bedroom was a place of excess. There was no such thing as a minimalist approach to decorating. Bedrooms were filled with lavish furniture, grand wardrobes, intricate dressing tables, heavy armchairs, and sometimes even a chaise lounge. Every piece of furniture had its purpose, and every object was positioned just so, all to create an atmosphere that encouraged calmness and relaxation. But the most interesting part? The room was meticulously arranged to support sleep. Every detail, from the positioning of the furniture to the placement of the bed, was designed with rest in mind. In fact, many Victorians believed that the direction the bed faced was critical for optimal sleep. It was thought that the head of the bed should face north or south, depending on who you asked, with the feet pointing toward the door. The theory was that this alignment would help the sleeper harness the Earth's natural energy, promoting better rest and overall well-being. You might chuckle at this today, but it shows just how much thought the Victorians put into their sleep space. Then, there's the matter of lighting. Unlike today, where we have an array of bulbs and light switches to control our environment, the Victorians relied on oil lamps, candles, and gaslight to illuminate their homes. And trust me, the lighting in the bedroom was no exception. The use of dim, flickering light was thought to help prepare the mind for sleep. In fact, the mere act of dimming the lights at the end of the day was a kind of signal to the body that it was time to rest. Imagine settling into bed, the soft light of a candle casting a warm glow over the room. The shadows flicker gently, adding a sense of calm to the space. It's almost like the bedroom was a sanctuary, a place where all outside worries were left at the door. But here's the thing. Even though the bedroom was meant to be a peaceful retreat, it wasn't always as quiet as you might expect. Victorians were known for their love of soothing sounds, and many would keep a small clock ticking in the room to lull them into a sense of calm. Some even had small music boxes or wind-up toys that played soft tunes to help them drift off. The idea was that these sounds, though faint, would create a peaceful environment, one that would guide them into a restful sleep. And of course, there's the whole matter of scent. The Victorians were obsessed with cleanliness and fragrance. A bedroom wasn't complete without a scent that spoke to the wearer's refinement. Lavender was a common choice, thought to induce relaxation and promote sleep. You could also find rose water, jasmine, and even sachets filled with dried flowers placed strategically around the room. The idea was that the fragrance would create a soothing atmosphere, making it easier to drift off into a deep sleep. But perhaps the most bizarre item found in a Victorian bedroom was the sleeping mask. Now, this wasn't the kind of a mask you might wear on a long-haul flight, no? This was a piece of cloth, often made from silk or velvet, that covered the eyes during sleep. It was designed to block out light completely, ensuring that nothing disturbed the sleeper's rest. While today, we might reach for a blackout curtain or a high-tech sleep mask, the Victorians used a far simpler and perhaps less comfortable approach. But to them, it was necessary. Anything that could ensure uninterrupted sleep was a worthy investment. All of these details, from the high bed frames to the delicate fragrances, were a reflection of how seriously the Victorians took their sleep. To them, the bedroom wasn't just a place to rest. It was a place to prepare the body and mind for the next day. It was a sanctuary, a place where every element contributed to the idea of restorative rest. The bed was the centerpiece of the room, but it was far from the only factor that determined whether or not a person would sleep soundly. So, as you can see, the Victorian bedroom was more than just a place to sleep. It was a carefully curated environment designed to foster restfulness, health, and peace of mind. It's almost as if the whole room was a giant sleep ritual in itself. And trust me, they took it very seriously. As we move on to the next section, let's take a deeper dive into how the Victorians handled the rituals of sleep when it came to specific practices that helped them get a good night's rest, whether they were sleeping alone or sharing a bed with loved ones. So now that we've explored the Victorian bedroom, it's time to take a closer look at how people actually got into bed and settled down for the night. Because as much as we think the ritual of going to bed is straightforward, for the Victorians, it was just as much about how they went to sleep as where they went to sleep. And to be honest, some of their bedtime practices might seem a little, well, excessive by today's standards. But for them, it was all part of the perfect pre-sleep routine. Let's start with the clothing. Oh yes, we can't forget about the role that attire played in the Victorian sleep ritual. The Victorians were famously meticulous about how they dressed, and sleepwear was no exception. A simple pair of pajamas would have been far too easy for them. Instead, the upper echelons of society had their own wardrobe dedicated to sleep. For women, it was all about long, flowing nightgowns made from cotton, silk, or even satin. These weren't just any nightgowns. Mind you, they were often intricately embroidered or decorated with lace. Imagine that, getting into bed after a long day, and there you are in your finest sleepwear, ready to rest in style. For men, the attire was a bit more practical, but no less formal. A long flannel or linen nightshirt was the norm, along with a pair of matching trousers. They also wore what were known as bed jackets, which were lightweight garments meant to provide a bit more warmth without being too heavy. You have to picture it, getting into bed after a long day, pulling up your covers, and resting your head on a pillow, all while wrapped in your finest fabric, of course. But there's something that might surprise you about Victorian sleep attire. While these garments were certainly fancy, they weren't just for comfort or style. Oh no, they were an important part of the overall ritual of sleep. You see, for many Victorians, putting on their sleeping clothes signaled that they were entering a different state of being, a transition from the demands of daily life to the peaceful sanctuary of sleep. It was a way of psychologically preparing for rest, a clear marker that the day was over and it was time to enter a world of tranquility. Now, let's move on to the actual act of getting into bed. After a long day of working, socializing, and attending to the various duties and obligations that were expected of them, the Victorians didn't just roll into bed carelessly. No. The act of getting into bed was something done with care and intention. The preparation wasn't just about the attire, it was about mentally and physically winding down from the demands of the day. In fact, many Victorians practiced what was known as bedtime rituals before they even touched the sheets. This could include things like reading a book, something light and easy to digest, sipping on a final cup of tea, or even engaging in prayer. This was the moment when the Victorian mind was allowed to shift gears, transitioning from the world of the living to the world of sleep. Now, I don't know about you, but today, most of us are more likely to scroll through our phones or binge watch a show before bed, certainly not taking the time to prepare ourselves mentally for a restful night's sleep. But here's something that might make you chuckle. Not all Victorians were interested in making their sleep as peaceful as possible. Some, particularly those of a more eccentric disposition, believed that the perfect night's sleep could only be achieved by performing certain actions before going to bed. For example, there was a belief that sleeping on a specific side of the bed could affect your dreams. Yes, that's right. If you wanted sweet dreams, you might need to sleep on the right side of the bed, while the left side was reserved for nightmares. Strange, right? But again, this was all part of the Victorian obsession with routine and control. Another quirky habit was the use of sleeping pills or tonics, which weren't necessarily medicinal in the way we think of them today. These tonics could range from herbal concoctions made from calming plants like chamomile or valerian root to, believe it or not, alcohol. That's right. Many Victorians would drink a small glass of brandy or wine before bed to help them relax. Today, we might find this a little counterproductive. I mean, alcohol disrupting sleep is hardly a new revelation. But in the Victorian era, it was considered just another part of the ritual to ensure a restful night's sleep. And of course, we can't forget about the nightly kiss, or rather, the good night ritual. For the Victorian family, this ritual wasn't just a way to say good night to your loved ones. It was a way to ensure that everyone was in their proper place for the night. This could include a kiss from a parent to a child, a parting gesture from a spouse, or even the act of giving a final blessing before sleep. For some families, these rituals were performed in the bedchamber itself, as the last act before the lights were dimmed and sleep descended upon a household. But perhaps the most peculiar of all bedtime habits was the practice of sleeping alone. While it might sound odd today, many Victorians, particularly the upper classes, believed that sleep was a solitary affair. In fact, many husbands and wives slept in separate rooms, sometimes even separate beds. Now, I'm not saying it was all about avoiding each other. There were plenty of other social and cultural factors at play. The Victorians were all about maintaining a sense of propriety, and sleeping separately was thought to help preserve the sanctity of the marriage bed. But when you think about it, it does seem a bit strange by modern standards, doesn't it? So, after all these preparations, getting dressed, following your rituals, maybe even reading a bit before bed, it was finally time to lie down and get some sleep. But even then, the Victorian sleep process didn't end there. Oh no, it was all about ensuring that everything around you supported your rest, from the direction of the bed to the air you breathe, and even the sounds you heard. And that's where we'll pick up next, as we explore the environment itself, and how it was meticulously crafted to enhance rest and restore the body and mind. Now that we've covered the attire, the rituals, and the odd little superstitions around sleep, let's dig deeper into the actual environment in which the Victorians tried to achieve their elusive, perfect sleep. The bedroom, as we've seen, wasn't just a place to crash after a long day. It was a sanctuary, a carefully constructed environment that catered to every whim of relaxation and rest. And when it came to achieving the best sleep, the Victorians had a few tricks up their sleeves. One of the first things you might have noticed stepping into a Victorian bedroom was the overwhelming attention to detail in the room's layout. The bed was, of course, the centerpiece, but the placement of everything else, furniture, accessories, and even the color of the walls, was designed with sleep in mind. The room's design aimed to cultivate an atmosphere of calm and tranquility, which, when paired with their elaborate bedtime rituals, was meant to ensure that the sleeper would drift off into a peaceful slumber. But the room's most important feature wasn't just its furniture or decorative accents. It was the air. Yes, the Victorians were obsessed with ventilation and airflow. They believed that the quality of the air in the bedroom played a crucial role in the quality of sleep, and they went to great lengths to ensure that the room was well ventilated. The windows, for example, would often be left slightly open during the night to let in fresh air, even in the colder months. This was, of course, long before we had central heating and air conditioning, so they had to make do with what they had, but the principle was clear. Good sleep required a flow of fresh, clean air. The importance of fresh air was so ingrained in their sleep rituals that some even believed that poor ventilation could lead to illness or nightmares. Now, imagine the scene. You're tucked into your bed, draped in your finest nightgown, the candlelight flickering softly in the background, and the scent of lavender gently filling the air. As you settle in, you might hear the faint ticking of a clock or the soft rustling of the wind outside. In this tranquil setting, you're supposed to forget the worries of the day and let yourself slip into a deep, rejuvenating sleep. But the Victorians didn't stop at just fresh air and a comfortable bed. They also believed that the room should be free of any distractions that might disturb sleep. No loud noises, no bright lights, just silence and darkness. This brings us to the idea of light in the Victorian bedroom. Of course, they didn't have the electric lights we rely on today. Instead, they used gas lamps, oil lamps, and candles to provide the soft, flickering light necessary to set the mood for sleep. But when it came time to actually get into bed, the lamps were either dimmed or extinguished entirely. The Victorian approach to sleep was all about creating a cocoon of quiet darkness, where the outside world couldn't intrude. But it wasn't just about the darkness. It was about the feeling of safety that came with it. The dim lighting, combined with the heavy curtains often drawn over the windows, created a sense of seclusion, as if the outside world had been shut out entirely. For many Victorians, sleep wasn't just a physical necessity. It was a mental retreat, a chance to escape the harshness of daily life, if only for a few hours. But let's not forget about the actual process of falling asleep, because for the Victorians, even the act of turning off was a deliberate ritual. You see, many Victorians didn't just flop in a bed and pass out. No, there was an entire routine to prepare the body for rest. After settling into their beds, many would spend a few moments in quiet contemplation or prayer. Some might even use this time to reflect on the day's events, mentally recounting the tasks completed, the conversations had, or the lessons learned. The idea was that sleep could not come easily if the mind was racing, so it was essential to clear the mind before closing your eyes. Interestingly, some of the most extreme Victorian sleep enthusiasts took this idea even further. They were so obsessed with achieving perfect sleep that they would engage in what could be called a sleep induction ritual. This could involve a few minutes of slow, deliberate breathing, or even imagining oneself floating in a serene, calm space. It sounds a bit strange, I know, but this practice was taken seriously by some. For them, the idea of forcing themselves into a state of sleep was almost as important as the actual sleep itself. The slower the process, the better the rest. And while we might think of sleep as a personal, solitary activity today, the Victorians weren't always so independent when it came to getting a good night's sleep. Many families, particularly in smaller homes, slept together in shared spaces. Couples often slept in the same bed, though sometimes separate beds were used, especially if one partner was considered a poor sleeper. Children, too, might share a room with their parents or with their siblings. However, in wealthier households, each member of the family might have their own room, and sometimes even their own bed, but they would still practice many of the same rituals. The concept of family sleep was quite common, especially in the lower classes, and it was thought that sleeping together offered comfort, protection, and a sense of familial bond. For the Victorians, sleep wasn't just about resting, it was about maintaining the social order and reinforcing family ties. However, in some cases, the concept of sleeping alone was taken quite seriously. Many upper-class families preferred that their children sleep in separate rooms, even from an early age. This idea of sleeping alone was often tied to a belief in fostering independence and discipline, especially for boys. But for girls, this often meant that they had to adhere to even stricter bedtime rituals. Some parents believed that separating their daughters from the rest of the family was a way to instill a sense of propriety and encourage more proper behaviors. This wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was about socialization and teaching children to behave according to their gender roles. All in all, the Victorian sleep environment was as carefully curated as the rituals leading up to it. From the arrangement of furniture to the quality of the air, every detail had a role to play in ensuring that the individual received the most restful, rejuvenating sleep possible. It was a combination of comfort, ritual, and, dare I say, a little bit of superstition. The Victorians didn't just sleep, they practiced it. They made sure every element, from the air they breathed to the bed they lay on, was designed for maximum relaxation. So, as we move forward, let's explore how the idea of sleep and rest was not just a private affair, but also influenced by broader societal trends, including how the Victorians viewed the role of sleep in health, morality, and well-being. It's about to get even more interesting. As we've seen, sleep in the Victorian era wasn't just a simple matter of closing your eyes and resting your head on a pillow. No, it was a carefully curated, multi-step process that involved rituals, specific attire, and a meticulously arranged sleep environment. But beyond these personal and familial habits, sleep also played a crucial role in the broader Victorian worldview, one that connected health, morality, and even social status. For the Victorians, sleep wasn't just about physical rest. It was intrinsically linked to personal well-being, discipline, and even one's social and moral character. They believed that a good night's sleep wasn't only a sign of good health, but also of a well-ordered life. If you were able to sleep soundly, it was assumed you were living in accordance with the rules of society, upstanding, responsible, and morally sound. Conversely, if someone suffered from poor sleep or insomnia, it wasn't just seen as a physical ailment. It was often considered a moral failing. The Victorians were quick to assume that sleeplessness was a sign of personal indulgence, anxiety, or worse, a lack of character. It's almost laughable by today's standards, isn't it? In our modern world, insomnia is often treated as a medical condition, something that requires intervention or therapy. But for the Victorians, it was more of a reflection of one's moral fiber. So imagine if you were a Victorian who had trouble sleeping. Chances are, your friends and family might have gently hinted that your lack of rest could be a sign that you were living in a less than righteous way. What a pressure that must have been. But beyond personal morality, sleep was also seen as an essential part of maintaining health. The Victorians, being staunch believers in the connections between mind, body, and spirit, thought that sleep was the body's natural method of self-repair. Sleep, they believed, was a form of medicine, a way for the body to heal and rejuvenate after the wear and tear of daily life. For those of higher social standing, sleep was almost like an art form, a necessary part of self-care that required the perfect environment, food, and routine. If you followed all the rules, sleep would come easily, and you'd wake up the next morning refreshed and ready to take on whatever challenges awaited you. But for the working class, the story was different. The idea of sleep as a restorative process was somewhat idealized by the upper classes, but for many Victorians, especially those in lower socioeconomic groups, sleep was a luxury. They worked long hours in factories, fields, and homes, often having to make do with cramped, uncomfortable sleeping arrangements. Many couldn't afford the luxury of a comfortable mattress, and some families had to share a single bed or even sleep on the floor. This, of course, made it much harder to get a good night's rest. And here's the thing. Despite the Victorians' obsession with sleep rituals and ideal sleep conditions, there were many factors that made sleep a luxury reserved for the rich. While the wealthy could afford separate rooms, cozy beds, and soothing rituals, the poor were left to make do with what little they had. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for families to sleep in shifts, with some members taking turns on the bed while others slept on the floor or couch. For the working class, sleep wasn't something to be luxuriated in. It was something to be squeezed in whenever possible. But even within these limitations, there was a growing sense of concern about sleep deprivation among the working class. As the Industrial Revolution progressed and work hours stretched longer, there were increasing calls for social reform to address the sleeping conditions of the lower classes. Doctors and social activists began to raise awareness about the importance of sleep and the detrimental effects of sleep deprivation. They argued that a well-rested workforce would be more productive, healthier, and less prone to accidents or illness. And so, as the century wore on, sleep began to take on a more scientific importance. Doctors and researchers started to study sleep patterns and habits, with the goal of understanding how to optimize rest for both health and performance. But even with all the advances in medical knowledge, the core beliefs around sleep, its connection to morality, health, and social status, remained firmly entrenched. But not all Victorians viewed sleep through the lens of science or social expectation. Some believed in the mystical properties of sleep. For certain segments of Victorian society, sleep wasn't just a time for rest. It was a portal to the supernatural. Many believed that dreams were messages from beyond the grave, or that sleep could offer glimpses into the future. People would often try to interpret their dreams, seeking to unlock hidden meanings about their lives or even their fates. Some Victorians turned to dream books, which claimed to provide the meaning behind common dream symbols. Others would consult fortune tellers or spiritualists, believing that sleep could bring them closer to the divine or the unknown. Interestingly, sleep and dreams were also linked to the rapidly growing interest in psychology and the study of the mind. The Victorians were some of the first to seriously investigate the connection between sleep and the unconscious mind. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, began to develop his theories about the role of dreams and sleep in the early 20th century, and by this point, the foundations for what we would call modern psychology had already been laid. In fact, it was the Victorians who first made sleep a subject of scientific inquiry, linking it to our mental and emotional states in ways that had never been done before. But let's not get too bogged down in the technicalities. What's more fascinating is the idea that sleep could be, in a sense, a reflection of the Victorian psyche. Their obsession with sleep, the rituals, the restrictions, the boundaries, all spoke to a culture that was deeply invested in self-control, discipline, and maintaining a sense of order. For the Victorians, sleep wasn't just a necessity. It was a symbol of their moral and social standing. How you slept, where you slept, and how well you slept were all part of the intricate web that defined your place in society. So, the next time you toss and turn in bed, thinking about your busy day or what's coming up tomorrow, remember, the Victorians would have seen your sleep struggles as a reflection of your personal failings, or perhaps, if you had the proper routine, as a sign that you were truly living the good life. As we continue, let's explore the impact of sleep on their emotional and psychological well-being, and how the idea of sleep as a restorative and mystical process continued to evolve. Now that we've explored how sleep was intertwined with the Victorians' views on health, morality, and social status, let's take a closer look at how sleep rituals also impacted their emotional and psychological well-being. The Victorians were deeply invested in the connection between body, mind, and spirit. They believed that sleep wasn't just a physical necessity. It was a reflection of mental and emotional harmony. How well you slept could reveal a lot about your inner state, and therefore, the way you approached rest was taken very seriously. The idea of mental health as we understand it today didn't quite exist in Victorian times, but they certainly had their own interpretations of psychological well-being. To them, sleep was a key indicator of whether or not a person was emotionally balanced. It was thought that a good night's sleep would restore the mind, allowing individuals to awaken refreshed, clear-headed, and ready to face the world. A restless night, on the other hand, was often seen as a sign of inner turmoil. Sleep disturbances, whether from nightmares, anxiety, or stress, were linked to emotional imbalance, and the Victorians believed that addressing these issues before sleep was crucial for mental health. This idea extended to the relationship between sleep and dreams. For the Victorians, dreams were more than just random images or subconscious ramblings. they were windows into the mind. Dreams, they believed, could reveal deep-seated fears, desires, or unresolved conflicts. Some even went as far as to consult dream books or spiritual guides to interpret their nighttime visions, seeking to understand what their dreams might be telling them about their emotional state. The Victorians saw sleep as a way of processing the day's events, of confronting emotions that were too difficult to face during waking hours. In this way, sleep wasn't just about physical rest. It was a tool for self-exploration and self-regulation. But the connection between sleep and psychological well-being wasn't all about dream interpretation. The Victorians also saw sleep as a form of mental discipline. In an era where self-control was prized above all else, the ability to manage your sleep was viewed as a sign of personal strength. Insomnia, for example, was seen not only as a medical issue, but as a moral failing. If you couldn't fall asleep, it was assumed that something was wrong with you. Perhaps you were too anxious, too stressed, or worse, simply lacking the discipline to wind down. This pressure to sleep properly must have been immense, especially given how important sleep was to their sense of personal and social identity. It wasn't enough to simply rest. One had to rest well. This notion of good sleep also extended to the emotional aspects of relationships. In Victorian society, how you slept was often linked to your emotional health, especially in marriage. Many people in the upper classes practiced separate sleeping arrangements, whether in separate beds or even separate rooms. This wasn't necessarily a reflection of an unhappy marriage, but rather a reflection of how emotionally demanding and highly regulated Victorian society was. In some cases, sleeping apart allowed couples to maintain their own personal space and emotional privacy, which was considered important for preserving emotional stability. For others, however, sleeping separately could be a sign of emotional distance or a troubled marriage. The Victorians believed that sleep, as with everything else, should be orderly and controlled, sometimes even to the point of emotional separation. And then, of course, there was the emotional importance of sleep as it related to family dynamics. The Victorians valued familial ties and believed that sleep played an important role in strengthening those bonds. The idea of children sleeping with their parents, especially during the early years, was common. This closeness, though it may seem odd to us today, was thought to promote emotional security and comfort. The act of sharing a bed with a parent was seen as a way for children to feel safe and protected. This was particularly important in an era where children were often expected to behave according to strict societal norms from a very young age. A well-rested child, it was believed, was better equipped to face the challenges of Victorian society, be it in school, at home, or in social settings. However, the emotional toll of sleep was also apparent in the darker side of Victorian life. The Industrial Revolution brought with it not just new opportunities, but also new anxieties. With long working hours, poor living conditions, and the stress of urban life, sleep was often elusive for the lower classes. The Victorians were well aware of this, and many saw sleep deprivation as a contributing factor to poor mental health, particularly among the working class. Anxiety, depression, and stress were rampant, but the language to describe these emotions was less developed than it is today. Sleep disorders, particularly insomnia, were often chalked up to moral failings or emotional weakness, rather than as signs of deeper mental health issues. This lack of understanding of mental illness often made it difficult for those who struggled with sleep to seek proper treatment or support. At the same time, the Victorians were beginning to explore the idea of using sleep as a therapeutic tool. In the late 19th century, the emerging field of psychology began to focus more on the mind's role in sleep. Doctors and specialists began to experiment with various methods of inducing sleep, including hypnosis, as a way to treat patients with anxiety, insomnia, or emotional distress. In a sense, they were pioneering some of the concepts that we now associate with modern sleep therapy though without the understanding of psychology that we have today. But despite their progressive exploration, there was still a great deal of stigma attached to mental health issues, particularly in regard to sleep. The connection between emotional distress and sleep problems was slowly being recognized, but it wasn't until the 20th century that a more comprehensive understanding of sleep disorders began to emerge. So, for the Victorians, sleep wasn't just a physical process, it was deeply emotional and psychological. The ability to sleep well was tied to one's moral character, emotional stability, and even social standing. A poor sleeper was often viewed with suspicion, while those who could follow the rigid rituals of Victorian bedtime were seen as disciplined, healthy, and morally sound. Sleep was both a personal and societal marker of good mental health, and it was closely linked to an individual's overall well-being. This intense focus on sleep may seem extreme, but it reveals how deeply the Victorians believed in the connection between body and mind. As we continue our exploration of sleep in the Victorian era, we'll turn our attention to some of the stranger, more supernatural aspects of their beliefs surrounding sleep. From dream interpretation to the fear of sleep-related illnesses, there was much more to sleep than just a physical need. Now that we've delved into the emotional and psychological aspects of sleep, it's time to explore some of the more peculiar and supernatural beliefs that the Victorians held regarding sleep and dreams. After all, this was an era deeply fascinated with the unknown, the mysterious, and the mystical, so it should come as no surprise that sleep, an activity so essential to life, was linked with all sorts of supernatural beliefs and practices. For the Victorians, sleep wasn't just a natural biological process. It was, in many ways, a portal to other realms. They believed that during sleep, the soul could wander, dreams could offer glimpses into the future, and messages from the dead could be received. It sounds almost like something out of a Gothic novel, doesn't it? But these ideas were taken very seriously by many in Victorian society, especially among the more spiritually inclined. Dreams, in particular, were a source of intense fascination. The Victorians didn't just see dreams as random fragments of the unconscious. They thought dreams were deeply meaningful. They believed that dreams could be prophetic, giving hints about the future or uncovering hidden truths about the dreamer's life. To the Victorians, a dream wasn't just a casual occurrence. It was a mystical experience that required serious attention. People would often consult dream books or spiritualists to interpret their dreams, searching for clues about their fate or the meaning behind the strange imagery that visited them at night. These dream books were filled with interpretations of common symbols, like water, fire, or animals, and their meanings. A woman dreaming of a snake, for example, might be warned of betrayal or danger, while dreaming of a horse could symbolize strength and power. It was believed that unlocking these hidden meanings could provide invaluable insights into one's life and future. But it wasn't just about interpreting dreams. It was also about preventing bad dreams or nightmares. The Victorians were particularly concerned with nightmares, as they often believed that such disturbing dreams were a sign of a disturbed mind or an imbalance in one's life. To ward off bad dreams, some people placed protective charms or amulets under their pillows. Others might burn certain herbs, like sage or lavender, in the room to create a calming atmosphere. These rituals were designed to keep evil spirits at bay and ensure that sleep remained undisturbed by nightmarish visions. This belief in the supernatural influence of sleep didn't just extend to dreams. It also connected to a broader belief in the spiritual power of rest itself. Many Victorians, especially those involved in the spiritualist movement, believed that sleep was a time when the soul could leave the body and travel to other realms. There were accounts of people claiming to have had out-of-body experiences during sleep or to have communicated with spirits through dreams. Some even believed that the dead could visit them in their sleep, offering guidance or warning about things to come. This fascination with spiritual communication during sleep was tied to the Victorian obsession with the afterlife and the belief that death was not an end, but a transition into another world. So, it wasn't uncommon for people to turn to sleep as a means of maintaining contact with loved ones who had passed away. In fact, this connection between sleep and the afterlife was such a pervasive belief that some Victorian families even set up death watches during the night. In the case of a dying loved one, family members would take turns watching over them while they slept or were unconscious, waiting for signs that the person had passed into the next world. This practice was rooted in the belief that sleep was a liminal space, a threshold between life and death, and that being present during this time could help guide the soul on its journey. The idea that sleep and death were connected in such a spiritual way reveals how deeply embedded these supernatural beliefs were in Victorian society. But not all of the Victorian ideas about sleep were related to the supernatural. Some are based on a more practical, albeit no less strange, understanding of the mind and body. For example, many Victorians believed that sleeping in a completely dark room was essential for proper rest. However, they didn't just mean dimming the lights or closing the curtains. They believed that even the smallest amount of light could disrupt the body's natural sleep cycle and negatively impact health. In fact, they took this idea so seriously that they would often go to great lengths to ensure that their bedrooms were completely devoid of light. Windows were covered with heavy curtains, and candles or oil lamps were placed far away from the bed to avoid even the faintest glow. One particularly odd practice was the use of sleeping masks, which we briefly touched on earlier. These are not the kind of sleep masks you might use today to block out light. They were much more rigid and could be made from a variety of materials, including silk or velvet. The idea was to cover the eyes completely, blocking out any light and allowing the sleeper to drift off into a state of deep, undisturbed sleep. Some masks even had additional features, like small weights, to apply gentle pressure to the eyes, which was thought to encourage relaxation and promote a deeper sleep. Though these masks seem peculiar to us today, they were considered an essential part of the perfect sleep environment in Victorian society. Beyond the physical aspects of sleep, there were also bizarre beliefs about how to control and manipulate the sleep process. Some Victorians believed that sleeping on a specific side of the bed could affect the quality of rest. For example, sleeping on the left side was said to bring bad dreams or nightmares, while the right side was believed to encourage peaceful, restorative sleep. This belief wasn't just about comfort or preference. It was thought that the direction in which one slept had a direct impact on one's mental and physical state. In the late 19th century, as psychology and the study of the mind began to gain popularity, some Victorians took a more scientific approach to sleep. They began to explore the idea that sleep disturbances, such as insomnia, could be linked to deeper psychological issues. Some of the first sleep clinics and treatments for insomnia emerged in the Victorian era, though they were still in their infancy. The concept of sleep as a way to heal the mind, to repair the emotional and psychological damage done by the stress of daily life, was slowly beginning to take hold. Despite the growing interest in science and psychology, the supernatural remained a significant part of the Victorian understanding of sleep. People were still drawn to the mystical and spiritual aspects of rest, finding meaning in their dreams and believing that sleep was a gateway to the otherworldly. These beliefs weren't necessarily at odds with the emerging scientific understanding of sleep. Rather, they coexisted, each providing a different lens through which the Victorians viewed the importance of sleep in their lives. As we continue to explore the complex role that sleep played in Victorian society, it's important to recognize how these supernatural beliefs were not merely fantasies or superstitions. They were deeply woven into the fabric of the era, influencing everything from social norms to health practices. In the next section, we'll look at how these sleep practices and beliefs shaped the larger cultural landscape and how they continue to influence us, even today. As we continue our journey into the Victorian approach to sleep, we see that these customs and rituals weren't just individual quirks or personal preferences. No, they were deeply ingrained in the larger cultural fabric of the time. The way Victorians approached sleep, health, and rest reflected their broader worldview, one that was shaped by both the social structures of the era and a growing awareness of the mind-body connection. Sleep was not just about personal comfort or physiological necessity. It was an essential part of the social order, a reflection of one's character, and, in some cases, a demonstration of one's moral worth. The Victorians placed an immense amount of importance on routine and discipline. Their belief in the benefits of a structured daily life extended to every part of their existence, even to something as seemingly mundane as sleep. This commitment to order was not just for health reasons, but also for the sake of social conformity. A well-regulated life, with established rules and rituals for every part of the day, was seen as a mark of virtue and respectability. This focus on structure was in part a response to the rapid industrialization and urbanization of the era. As society began to change at an unprecedented pace, the Victorians looked to the reliability of routines to maintain a sense of control in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic. Sleep, then, was a reflection of this broader cultural ethos. The Victorian commitment to strict routines meant that the hours leading up to sleep, whether spent in social engagement, relaxation, or personal care, were carefully planned. This structure not only promoted physical well-being, but also ensured that an individual's emotional and mental state was in balance. After all, if your sleep habits were off, it could suggest a deeper moral or psychological failing. If you couldn't adhere to these rituals, it was often seen as a sign of weakness, disorganization, or even spiritual failing. The cultural focus on sleep and well-being also mirrored the growing interest in science and medicine during the Victorian period. As the medical field advanced, doctors began to explore the intricate connections between sleep and physical health. The emerging field of psychology also started to shed light on how the mind influenced the body, particularly how mental health conditions like anxiety and depression could manifest in disrupted sleep patterns. But even as these scientific advancements were being made, the supernatural and spiritual elements of sleep remained deeply rooted in Victorian culture. This tension between the emerging scientific understanding of sleep and the deeply ingrained supernatural beliefs created a fascinating, and sometimes contradictory, view of sleep in the era. Take, for example, the rise of spiritualism during the Victorian period. This movement, which grew in popularity throughout the 19th century, was based on the belief that the dead could communicate with the living. Seances, ghostly visitations, and attempts to contact loved ones through dreams or in sleep became common practices among the upper classes. These beliefs were tied to the broader cultural fascination with the afterlife, a topic that held an especially strong grip on the Victorian imagination. Many people sought out ways to maintain connections with the deceased, especially during sleep when they believed they were most vulnerable to spiritual messages. Sleep, in this context, became not just a time for rest, but a portal to the other side. This spiritual approach to sleep was not universally accepted, of course. The scientific and medical communities were gradually moving away from supernatural explanations for sleep disturbances, focusing instead on physical or psychological causes. But for many Victorians, these mystical beliefs about sleep coexisted alongside medical understandings. Some physicians even suggested that dreams and nighttime visions could have psychological significance, and that paying attention to the content of one's dreams could offer insights into emotional or mental health. The idea that sleep could be a way to unlock the hidden recesses of the mind was something that both doctors and spiritualists could agree on, even if they had very different explanations for what that process meant. Interestingly, some of the most popular sleep remedies in Victorian times reflected this intersection between science and the supernatural. For example, The use of sleeping tonics or herbal remedies was widespread, and many of these concoctions contain ingredients thought to have calming or hypnotic effects. Valerian root, chamomile, and lavender were common ingredients in these sleep aids, as they were believed to promote relaxation and restful sleep. But beyond these more natural remedies, some Victorians turned to more extreme measures, including hypnotism and early forms of psychotherapy, to treat sleep disorders. Hypnosis, in particular, became a popular treatment for insomnia and anxiety, as it was believed to tap into the subconscious mind to bring about a more restful state. It's fascinating to think about how these practices, which now seem both scientific and therapeutic, were part of the broader belief system that sleep could not only heal the body, but also offer insight into the soul. Sleep, however, wasn't just a tool for individual self-care. It was also an expression of social status. How one slept, where one slept, and the quality of one's sleep environment all served as indicators of one's position in society. The wealthy could afford elaborate bedrooms with the finest furnishings, the most comfortable beds, and the best sleep aids money could buy. In contrast, the working classes had little control over their sleep environments, often forced to make do with uncomfortable conditions that hindered restful sleep. The divide between the sleep practices of the rich and the poor highlighted the growing disparities between social classes during the Victorian period. The upper classes could afford to indulge in the luxury of a good night's sleep, while the lower classes struggled to get even a few hours of rest in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. The idea that sleep could be both a personal and societal marker continued to evolve throughout the Victorian period. As the era progressed, the importance of sleep became more widely recognized in both medical and social circles. There were increased calls for better working conditions, better housing, and improved health care, all with the goal of ensuring that everyone had access to a good night's rest. But even as these social reforms took place, sleep continued to be a deeply personal experience, shaped by a complex blend of scientific, cultural, and spiritual beliefs. So, as you can see, sleep was far from a simple, passive activity during the Victorian era. It was wrapped up in ideas about morality, health, social status, and even the supernatural. The Victorians' obsession with sleep reveals just how deeply intertwined our physical and mental states are with the ways we view ourselves and our place in society. As we continue, we'll take a look at how the legacy of Victorian sleep rituals and beliefs has influenced modern approaches to rest, health, and well-being. Now that we've covered the cultural, emotional, and supernatural dimensions of sleep in the Victorian era, let's explore how these ideas and practices surrounding sleep have had a lasting influence on modern approaches to rest, health, and well-being. It might be hard to believe, but much of what the Victorians believed about sleep, though often peculiar and steeped in superstition, has shaped the way we think about sleep today. From modern sleep hygiene to our understanding of the mind-body connection, many of the concepts that were pioneered during the Victorian era are still alive and well, even if they've evolved into more scientifically backed approaches. The Victorians were the first to take sleep seriously in the way that we do today. They recognized the importance of sleep not just for physical health, but for mental and emotional well-being. Though many of their beliefs were based on superstition or spiritualism, the general principle that sleep is essential for maintaining a balanced life has persisted into modern times. Today, we understand that sleep is not only necessary for our bodies to rest and recover, but it's also critical for cognitive function, emotional regulation, and overall mental health. The Victorian understanding of sleep as a multifaceted process, connected to both body and mind, laid the groundwork for many of our current beliefs about rest. For instance, the Victorians understood the importance of routine and ritual in promoting good sleep, something that has become a cornerstone of modern sleep hygiene. Today, experts emphasize the need for a consistent sleep schedule, which is nearly identical to the Victorian approach of creating a regular bedtime routine. Back then, it wasn't just about getting into bed at the same time each night. It was about preparing both the body and mind for rest. From the Victorian tradition of dimming the lights to their practice of calming the mind before bed, these elements of sleep hygiene, though framed differently, still echo in today's recommendations for a calming pre-sleep routine. One of the most profound contributions the Victorians made to our understanding of sleep was the idea of the mind-body connection. While we now have advanced neurobiology to explain how sleep impacts our brain function and mental health, the Victorians were some of the first to link emotional well-being with sleep. They observed that sleep disturbances, such as insomnia or nightmares, were often a reflection of deeper emotional or psychological issues, even if they didn't have the language to fully describe it. Today, we understand that poor sleep is not only a symptom of stress or anxiety, but can also contribute to the development of these issues. Insomnia, for instance, is now recognized as both a symptom and a cause of mental health disorders, a concept the Victorians were beginning to hint at. The spiritual aspects of Victorian sleep beliefs, though often seen as archaic today, also have a lingering influence. Dream interpretation, which was such an important part of Victorian sleep culture, continues to be a popular interest for many people. While we no longer turn to dream books for mystical insights, modern psychology continues to explore the meaning of dreams through the lens of psychoanalysis, with figures like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung drawing on the Victorian fascination with the unconscious mind. Freud, in particular, made use of Victorian-era ideas by suggesting that dreams were a window into the unconscious, offering insight into repressed thoughts and desires. Though we now have a more scientific understanding of the unconscious mind, the basic notion that our dreams reveal something about our inner worlds is still a topic of ongoing study. The Victorian fascination with sleep rituals and the idea that sleep can influence one's emotional state also paved the way for our current understanding of sleep therapy. In the Victorian period, hypnosis was used as a method to induce sleep, a precursor to today's practices of cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, which focuses on changing the negative thought patterns that can interfere with sleep. While hypnosis is no longer a mainstream treatment, the principle remains the same: to address the underlying causes of sleep disturbances, not just the symptoms. The Victorians may not have had the sophisticated psychological tools we have today, but they were already onto the idea that sleep was a deeply interconnected process affected by both the body and the mind. Perhaps one of the most surprising ways in which Victorian sleep practices continue to affect us today is in our cultural views on sleep environments. The Victorians were obsessive about the atmosphere of their bedrooms. Light, air quality, and even the direction of the bed, all of which were thought to contribute to a restful night's sleep. Today, we're still told that creating the right sleep environment is key to good rest. This includes everything from temperature control to the use of blackout curtains and noise machines. While we may no longer use heavy curtains to block out the slightest bit of light, the fundamental principle remains. Our sleep environment plays a crucial role in how well we rest. In fact, modern research shows that the optimal sleep environment, cool, dark, and quiet, can improve sleep quality, just as the Victorians believed. The modern concept of sleep hygiene is another area where Victorian practices have influenced us. In addition to creating a soothing environment and following a consistent routine, the Victorians also had an awareness of the importance of dietary habits for sleep. Although they didn't have the same understanding of nutrition that we have today, their careful selection of evening meals, often light and calming, echoes today's advice to avoid heavy meals or caffeine close to bedtime. The emphasis on herbal teas, such as chamomile and valerian root, was another practice that laid the foundation for modern recommendations to use natural sleep aids, though today we have more research on their effectiveness and safety. And let's not forget the Victorian obsession with the timing of sleep. Their belief that sleeping at specific times, early to bed, early to rise, was beneficial for both the body and the mind continues to hold true today. We know now that maintaining a consistent sleep schedule and getting enough sleep during the optimal hours, typically between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., supports circadian rhythms, improves cognitive function, and boosts overall health. So, in a way, the Victorian view that proper sleep timing was essential for a healthy life is still alive and well. However, not all of the Victorian practices have aged as gracefully. Some of the more superstitious or mystical beliefs surrounding sleep, such as the idea that sleeping on the right side of the bed would guarantee pleasant dreams, or that sleep could be a means of spiritual communication with the dead, are far removed from our current understanding of sleep as a biological and psychological process. But it's fascinating to see how these beliefs, rooted in the era's spiritualism and fascination with the supernatural, continue to resonate in modern times in more symbolic ways. We may no longer expect to commune with spirits during sleep, but the idea that sleep has a connection to something greater, whether it's the mind, the soul, or the universe, remains with us in many forms. As we continue to explore the impact of Victorian sleep culture, we see that these beliefs, while often odd by today's standards, have helped shape our modern understanding of sleep as an essential, multifaceted part of life. The Victorians were ahead of their time in recognizing the importance of sleep, and many of their practices and beliefs still influence how we approach rest and recovery today. In our next section, we'll look at how the Victorian era's obsession with sleep influenced the arts, particularly in literature and art, where sleep, both as a literal and metaphorical theme, became a central subject. From Gothic novels to paintings that explored the mystery of sleep, the Victorians had a deep cultural fascination with the act of resting that continues to inspire creative work today. As we've seen, the Victorian era's obsession with sleep had far-reaching cultural implications, influencing not just health practices and social norms, but also the arts. Sleep, or more specifically, the idea of sleep, became a powerful theme in Victorian literature and visual art. Given the period's deep-seated interests in the supernatural, mental health, and the complexities of the human mind, it's no surprise that sleep, and its various mysteries, became a metaphor for many of the era's anxieties and desires. In literature, sleep was often depicted as a liminal space, where the boundaries between the real and the unreal, the living and the dead, were blurred. This theme is perhaps most famously seen in Gothic novels, which were incredibly popular during the Victorian era. Gothic writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, and Bram Stoker frequently explored the concept of sleep as both a literal and metaphorical state. For example, in Poe's short story The Fall of the House of Usher, sleep becomes a site of haunting and decay, where the characters' mental and emotional breakdowns manifest in their dreams and their inability to distinguish between wakefulness and sleep. Sleep, in this context, isn't a peaceful escape. It's a descent into madness, a reflection of the characters' troubled minds and souls. In fact, sleep's connection to madness was a recurring theme in Victorian Gothic literature. Authors often used sleep as a way to explore mental states, particularly in relation to fear, death, and the unknown. In Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, for instance, sleep is closely tied to Victor Frankenstein's mental disintegration. As he becomes consumed by his experiments, his sleep becomes restless and fragmented, mirroring his deteriorating state of mind. Sleep in this context is not restorative. It's a place where the mind's turmoil plays out in dreams, and it serves as a symbol of his guilt, his isolation, and his inability to escape the consequences of his actions. The idea of sleep as a portal to the subconscious also found its way into the works of other Victorian writers, such as Robert Louis Stevenson. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, sleep and dreams play a crucial role in the transformation of Dr. Jekyll into his darker alter ego, Mr. Hyde. The act of sleeping, or more specifically, the dreams that occurred during sleep, are a metaphor for the duality of human nature. Dr. Jekyll's attempts to control his darker impulses are undone while he sleeps, and he wakes up in the form of Hyde, a manifestation of his repressed desires. Sleep, in this case, becomes a gateway to the unconscious mind, where the boundaries between good and evil, order and chaos, are indistinguishable. This connection between sleep and the subconscious, especially in relation to the darker aspects of human nature, was not just confined to literature. Visual artists of the Victorian era also explored the theme of sleep in their work, often using it as a metaphor for psychological states or as a means of delving into the mysteries of the human mind. Painters like John William Waterhouse and Edward Burne-Jones created works that depicted sleep in surreal, dreamlike ways, often featuring women in states of repose or slumber. These depictions of sleeping figures were symbolic of the Victorian fascination with the unconscious mind and the idea that sleep held hidden truths about the self. One of the most famous Victorian works that explores sleep as both a physical and psychological phenomenon is Waterhouse's The Awakening of Adonis. This painting, which features the mythological figure of Adonis waking from a deep slumber, reflects the Victorian obsession with the boundary between sleep and death, the known and the unknown. Adonis awakening from sleep can be seen as a metaphor for the human quest for understanding and enlightenment, a central theme in Victorian thought. The contrast between the stillness of sleep and the activity of waking is portrayed with great detail, emphasizing the transition between these two states as a pivotal moment in the human experience. Sleep also played a significant role in the Victorian fascination with death and the afterlife. The concept of sleep as a metaphor for death, particularly in the context of Victorian mourning practices, was prevalent in both literature and art. The Victorians were obsessed with the idea that death was not an end, but a transition to another state, and sleep became the metaphorical space where this transition could take place. Many Victorian writers and artists portrayed death as a peaceful sleep, a quiet release from the struggles of life. This idea was reflected in works like The Death of Ophelia by John Everett Millais, where Ophelia is depicted floating peacefully in water, surrounded by flowers, as if she is simply in a deep sleep. This image of death as sleep was comforting to many Victorians, offering a romanticized view of death as a natural and serene end to life. In addition to the symbolism of sleep as death, there was also a growing interest in the idea of sleep as a transformative or transcendent experience. The Victorians were fascinated with the idea of spiritual awakenings and transformations that occurred during sleep, particularly in relation to dreams. Many Victorian writers and thinkers, influenced by the rise of spiritualism, believed that sleep was a gateway to otherworldly experiences. They argued that dreams could provide access to spiritual truths, allowing individuals to communicate with the dead or experience visions of the future. The idea that sleep could be a spiritual experience is reflected in works like the poetry of Christina Rossetti, who often explored themes of sleep as a metaphor for death, divine intervention, and eternal rest. The rise of spiritualism in the Victorian period also had a significant impact on how sleep and dreams were viewed. Spiritualists believed that the sleeping state was the time when a person's spirit could leave the body and communicate with the spiritual realm. Many people attended seances or participated in other forms of spiritual practices in the hopes of receiving messages from the dead during sleep. These practices, which were both popular and controversial, led to an even greater fascination with the idea of sleep as a doorway to spiritual experiences. This Victorian obsession with sleep, dreams, and the supernatural continued to influence artists and writers long after the era ended. The Surrealist movement of the early 20th century, for example, drew heavily on the Victorian themes of the unconscious mind and the symbolic power of dreams. The idea that sleep and dreams were realms of both mystery and revelation continued to shape the way we think about sleep today. In many ways, The Victorian approach to sleep reflects the complexity of their world, a world that was both steeped in scientific progress and deeply influenced by spiritual and supernatural beliefs. Sleep, in this context, wasn't just about rest. It was a way to explore the deepest parts of the human psyche, confront fears and desires, and even communicate with the beyond. The legacy of these Victorian beliefs still lingers in our own understanding of sleep, from our interest in dream analysis to the modern fascination with sleep therapy. In the next section, we'll shift our focus to the medical side of sleep during the Victorian era, looking at how sleep disorders were treated and how these early practices laid the groundwork for modern sleep medicine. It's fascinating to see how the early treatments for insomnia and other sleep-related issues reflect both the scientific advances and the cultural beliefs of the time. As we transition into the medical side of Victorian sleep practices, we see how the era's understanding of sleep disorders laid the groundwork for modern sleep medicine. While the Victorians may have had their superstitions and mystical beliefs surrounding sleep, they were also pioneers in recognizing the importance of sleep for overall health. It's fascinating to look at the treatments they employed and how their approaches to insomnia, nightmares, and other sleep disturbances both align with and differ from modern practices. First, let's address how sleep disorders were understood in the Victorian era. The concept of sleep disorders, as we know them today, didn't exactly exist. However, there was an awareness that sleep disturbances were more than just a passing nuisance. They could affect a person's mental, emotional, and physical health. The most common sleep-related issue at the time was insomnia, a condition that many Victorians experienced due to stress, anxiety, and the pressures of daily life. While modern medicine would attribute insomnia to a variety of psychological or physiological factors, the Victorians had a more straightforward approach. They often saw insomnia as a result of nervous disorders, a term used to describe a range of mental health issues from anxiety and depression to the more vague nervous exhaustion. Nervous exhaustion was, in fact, a common diagnosis for those suffering from chronic sleep deprivation. This was a condition that was often attributed to the stresses of modern life, including the demands of work, social engagements, and family obligations. It's no surprise that sleep deprivation was linked to an emotional or moral breakdown during the Victorian period, given the era's emphasis on self-discipline and control. The Victorians believed that an inability to sleep was a sign of weakness or moral failure. This moralizing approach meant that insomnia wasn't just treated as a physical ailment, but as something that could signify deeper personal problems. Interestingly, many Victorian treatments for insomnia involved remedies that we might still recognize today. One of the most common treatments was herbal medicine. Valerian root, lavender, and chamomile, plants known for their calming and sedative properties, were used to promote relaxation and induce sleep. These remedies were often taken in the form of teas or tinctures, and their popularity during the Victorian period paved the way for modern herbal sleep aids. While their effectiveness may have been anecdotal at the time, these remedies continue to be popular choices for those seeking natural alternatives to modern sleep medications. However, the Victorians didn't just rely on herbs to treat insomnia. They also had a range of more unconventional remedies that seem almost comical by today's standards. For example, some doctors recommended the use of sleeping draughts, which were essentially strong mixtures of alcohol and other sedative ingredients designed to knock the patient out for the night. The most famous of these was a mixture known as laudanum, an opium-based concoction that was widely used to treat a variety of ailments, including sleep disturbances. While laudanum had an undeniable calming effect, its addictive properties weren't fully understood at the time, and it wasn't uncommon for patients to become reliant on it to fall asleep. Another popular treatment for sleep disturbances in the Victorian era was the use of hypnosis. Though hypnosis was still a relatively new concept in the medical field, it was becoming increasingly popular as a treatment for insomnia. Physicians and medical practitioners like James Braid, a pioneer of modern hypnosis, believed that sleep could be induced through suggestion and relaxation techniques. Hypnosis offered a way to treat insomnia without the use of drugs, and its popularity among Victorians reflected their growing interest in psychology and the power of the mind over the body. Though not universally accepted, hypnosis was considered by many to be an effective way to address sleep-related issues, especially for those suffering from nervous conditions or anxiety. In addition to these treatments, the Victorians also turned to more traditional methods to improve sleep quality. One of the most well-known practices was the use of the sleeping mask. While the primary function of these masks was to block out light, something the Victorians believed disrupted sleep. The masks themselves were often elaborate, made from luxurious materials like silk or velvet. The idea was that by creating an environment of total darkness, the mind could more easily relax and enter a restful state. These masks were often worn at night as part of a broader ritual that included the calming effects of herbal remedies and a carefully regulated sleep environment. However, perhaps one of the most unusual treatments for sleep disorders during the Victorian era was the use of sleeping chambers specifically designed to induce rest. These were essentially darkened rooms, equipped with all sorts of devices to ensure optimal sleeping conditions. Some sleeping chambers were even designed with special ventilation systems to provide fresh air while blocking out noise and light. These chambers were often furnished with luxurious bedding and were designed to promote relaxation and comfort. The Victorians took the idea of creating the perfect sleep environment to a new level. And while these chambers might seem extravagant by today's standards, they reflected the era's commitment to achieving the best possible rest. Of course, no discussion of sleep in the Victorian era would be complete without mentioning the growing influence of the medical profession on sleep treatment. As the field of medicine advanced, doctors began to take a more scientific approach to sleep disorders. In addition to the herbal and physical treatments mentioned earlier, some doctors began to experiment with early forms of psychotherapy and behavioral treatment. This laid the foundation for the modern understanding of sleep disorders as medical conditions that could be treated through both physical and psychological methods. Doctors like Sigmund Freud, who would later revolutionize the study of dreams, were beginning to develop theories about the mind that would shape the future of sleep medicine. But despite the growing medical interest in sleep, the Victorians still clung to some of their more mystical beliefs about the importance of sleep. The idea that sleep was not just a physical process, but a spiritual one, continued to influence the treatment of sleep disorders. Spiritualism, which was a widespread movement during the Victorian period, played a significant role in how people viewed sleep. Many Victorians believed that sleep was a time when the soul could leave the body and travel to other realms, and some even consulted mediums or spiritualists to help them understand their dreams and sleep experiences. The connection between sleep and the supernatural persisted even as the medical profession began to develop more evidence-based treatments for sleep disorders. As the century drew to a close, Victorian doctors and researchers began to approach sleep with a more scientific mindset, even as they continued to integrate some of the spiritual and supernatural beliefs of the era. It was during this time that the groundwork for modern sleep medicine was being laid, and many of the treatments and practices we still use today, such as cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, the use of sleep medications, and the study of sleep cycles, were first explored. In our next section, we'll explore how the treatment of sleep disorders evolved during the 20th century and how the insights of the Victorian era helped shape the modern understanding of sleep. It's fascinating to see how far we've come in our understanding of sleep, yet how much of what the Victorians believed still informs the way we think about rest and health today. As we move into the 20th century, we can see how the legacy of the Victorian understanding of sleep began to take root in modern medicine. Many of the concepts, practices, and beliefs developed during the Victorian era helped lay the foundation for how we treat sleep disorders and understand the importance of rest today. While the spiritual and mystical interpretations of sleep gradually faded in favor of scientific approaches, the Victorians' belief in the profound connection between the mind and the body and their recognition of the psychological aspects of sleep left an indelible mark on the development of sleep medicine. In the early 1900s, sleep began to be studied more rigorously by scientists, and the understanding of sleep as an essential, restorative process started to gain traction. The idea of sleep as something not just necessary for physical recovery, but also for mental and emotional well-being became more widely accepted. While Freud's work on the unconscious mind and dreams continued to influence psychoanalysis, the advent of sleep research allowed for a more scientific approach to the subject. Sleep studies, or polysomnography, began to emerge in the 1920s, and this marked the beginning of a more systematic exploration of how sleep affects the body and the mind. One of the major breakthroughs in the understanding of sleep came with the discovery of sleep cycles and the identification of rapid eye movement, REM sleep. In 1953, researchers Nathaniel Kleitman and Eugene Aserinsky first identified REM sleep, a stage of sleep characterized by rapid eye movement and increased brain activity, and linked it to dreaming. This discovery was revolutionary because it showed that sleep is not a passive, uniform process, but a dynamic one with distinct stages. The identification of REM sleep, along with non-REM sleep stages, provided a deeper understanding of the structure of sleep and its effects on the body and mind. The idea that sleep was composed of different phases, each with its own role in restorative processes, was a direct evolution from the Victorian belief that sleep was a complex and multifaceted state of being. This new scientific approach helped move away from the more mystical views of sleep that were prevalent in the Victorian era, but some of the core ideas remained. For instance, the understanding that sleep has both physiological and psychological components continued to hold true. Sleep scientists began to explore the connection between sleep disturbances and mental health, linking insomnia and other sleep disorders to conditions like anxiety, depression, and stress. The Victorians had recognized that sleep could reflect mental and emotional states, but now modern medicine could explain how and why that connection existed. The emphasis on the mind-body connection that the Victorians had introduced became central to modern sleep medicine, as researchers began to study how mental health could impact sleep patterns and how poor sleep could, in turn, exacerbate mental health issues. The development of sleep medicine in the 20th century also saw the rise of sleep disorders as a recognized medical field. Conditions such as insomnia, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, and narcolepsy began to be understood and treated in new ways. The treatment of insomnia, in particular, took a giant leap forward, moving from Victorian-era herbal remedies and hypnosis to modern treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, and pharmacological interventions. CBTI, which is still considered the gold standard for treating chronic insomnia, focuses on changing thought patterns and behaviors that interfere with sleep, and it draws on many of the same principles that the Victorians had inadvertently highlighted when they emphasized the importance of mental discipline in creating a healthy sleep environment. However, the Victorian influence on sleep medicine didn't end with the scientific discoveries of the mid-20th century. Their emphasis on sleep hygiene and creating the ideal sleep environment is still relevant today. Modern sleep specialists emphasize the importance of a consistent sleep routine, the right sleep environment, cool, dark, and quiet, and lifestyle factors such as diet and exercise, all of which are ideas that the Victorians had long recognized as important for good sleep. The Victorians understood the importance of preparing both the mind and body for sleep, and today's sleep experts continue to advocate for the same principles, albeit with a more scientific understanding of why they work. The development of sleep therapy also owes much to the Victorians' fascination with dreams and the unconscious mind. Today, sleep therapists and researchers continue to explore the role of dreams in mental health and how they might reflect deeper psychological processes. While the Victorians believed that dreams could reveal prophetic messages or insights into one's character, modern research focuses on how dreams can be used to understand emotional states, cope with trauma, and process unresolved conflicts. The modern study of sleep and dreams as an important tool for psychological health can trace its roots back to the Victorian era, when writers and thinkers like Freud were laying the groundwork for our current understanding of the unconscious. Interestingly, the Victorian fascination with the spiritual aspects of sleep has also influenced the wellness industry today, though in a much more commercialized form. The use of meditation, aromatherapy, and mindfulness practices before sleep, once considered deeply spiritual practices, is now a mainstream part of many people's sleep routines. While the mystical elements of Victorian sleep practices have largely been abandoned, their focus on relaxation and mindfulness in the sleep process remains relevant. The modern obsession with sleep hygiene and self-care reflects a continuation of the Victorian notion that rest isn't just about physical relaxation. It's about mental and emotional renewal as well. In addition to the advancements in sleep science, the rise of sleep technology in the 21st century has taken many cues from the Victorian era's obsession with creating the perfect sleep environment. Modern innovations such as smart mattresses, sleep trackers, white noise machines, and apps designed to help regulate sleep patterns all echo the Victorian commitment to optimizing the sleep experience. Today's emphasis on sleep quality, as opposed to just the quantity of sleep, is a direct evolution of the Victorian focus on a well-curated and controlled sleep environment. Despite these advancements, some aspects of Victorian sleep culture, particularly their intense focus on routine and ritual, have become even more relevant today. In our fast-paced, hyper-connected world, the Victorian concept of winding down and taking time to prepare for sleep has become an antidote to the stresses and distractions that keep many of us awake at night. The modern popularity of digital detoxes, the growing focus on mindfulness and meditation, and the emphasis on creating a soothing pre-sleep routine are all echoes of the rituals that the Victorians practiced centuries ago. While we may no longer worry about spiritual visitations during our sleep or consult dream books for guidance, many of the fundamental ideas about sleep from the Victorian era continue to shape how we approach rest today. Whether we're using sleep technology to improve our quality of rest or following sleep hygiene practices to enhance our mental health, the Victorian legacy is still very much alive in our modern understanding of sleep. In the next section, we'll take a final look at the legacy of Victorian sleep culture and how it continues to resonate in our own lives. From the way we approach rest to the cultural significance of sleep, the influence of the past is still present in how we sleep today. As we reach the final stages of our exploration into the Victorian legacy of sleep, it's time to reflect on how the cultural beliefs, practices, and rituals surrounding sleep during that era continue to influence our modern understanding of rest. Though much has changed over the centuries in terms of technology and scientific understanding, the fundamental human need for sleep and the ways we approach it remain closely connected to the past. The Victorians were truly ahead of their time in many ways, particularly in how they viewed sleep as not only a physical necessity, but a psychological and even spiritual experience. In many respects, modern sleep science has progressed significantly from the Victorian era. We now have a far deeper understanding of the biological processes that occur during sleep, from circadian rhythms to REM cycles, and how sleep contributes to overall health, cognitive function, and emotional regulation. Yet, the Victorian period laid the groundwork for much of this research by treating sleep as an integral part of human well-being and, often, moral character. Their commitment to routine and the belief that sleep was a reflection of a person's emotional and psychological state are concepts that modern sleep medicine has built upon. For example, today's focus on creating a perfect sleep environment, quiet, dark, and cool, is rooted in the Victorian insistence on the importance of sleep surroundings. We now understand that factors like temperature, light exposure, and noise can significantly impact the quality of sleep, but these ideas were already in place back then. The Victorians were meticulous about the arrangement of their bedrooms, choosing the right materials for their bedding, and using candles, oil lamps, and herbs to create a soothing environment. Today, many people turn to technology, such as noise machines, sleep trackers, and temperature-controlled bedding, to mimic the meticulous conditions that the Victorians believed were necessary for a perfect night's sleep. Furthermore, the modern concept of sleep hygiene, which refers to the practices and habits that promote consistent and high-quality sleep, is essentially a contemporary rebranding of Victorian bedtime rituals. The Victorians were pioneers in this respect, emphasizing the importance of routine, winding down, and preparing both body and mind for sleep. They believed that rituals like sipping calming teas, reading light books, or engaging in quiet conversation were essential for winding down after a busy day, ideas that are central to modern sleep hygiene practices. The shift from a focus on physical comfort alone to a holistic view of sleep that includes emotional and mental well-being is a direct legacy of the Victorian emphasis on the connection between sleep, morality, and mental health. While much of the Victorian approach to sleep was based on ideas that have since been debunked, such as their belief in sleep as a spiritual experience or a direct reflection of one's moral fiber, their understanding of sleep as something sacred and essential to health has persisted. Today, we are more likely to view sleep as a fundamental aspect of mental and physical health, and as a crucial factor in emotional well-being. The Victorians, despite their sometimes overly romanticized or mystic beliefs, saw sleep as a holistic experience, one that involved careful attention to the mind, body, and spirit. Interestingly, the Victorians were also among the first to recognize the link between sleep and psychological disorders. Today, we have a much better understanding of how conditions like insomnia, sleep apnea, and anxiety are interconnected, but the Victorians were among the first to identify sleep disturbances as a symptom of deeper psychological distress. Their awareness of how anxiety and stress could disrupt sleep, and their attempts to treat insomnia through both physical and psychological means, foreshadowed much of the work in sleep medicine that we see today. For instance, treatments such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBTI, for insomnia are grounded in the same principles of mindfulness, self-regulation, and managing thought patterns that the Victorians often unintentionally explored in their own approaches to sleep. At the same time, the Victorian fascination with sleep as a space for introspection and spiritual connection continues to be reflected in our modern exploration of dreams and the unconscious mind. Today, many people still turn to dream interpretation as a way to understand their inner thoughts and emotions, much as the Victorians did with their dream books and spiritual practices. Psychologists like Sigmund Freud, who famously expanded on the Victorian interest in the unconscious, have given us tools to understand how dreams and sleep are deeply linked to mental health. The dream journals and the interpretation of recurring dream patterns are direct continuations of the Victorian fascination with using sleep to explore the psyche. The importance of a consistent, disciplined approach to sleep, so central to the Victorians, also lives on in our contemporary concerns about the sleep crisis, a term that refers to the growing epidemic of sleep deprivation across the globe. The Victorians recognized the social and moral consequences of poor sleep long before we had the scientific tools to measure sleep disorders on a large scale. Today, the medical community emphasizes the consequences of insufficient sleep on everything from cognitive function to emotional regulation to long-term health risks like heart disease. The cultural pressure the Victorians placed on getting adequate sleep has only grown in modern times, as we now understand the profound effects of sleep deprivation on our well-being. Another area where the Victorian legacy lives on is in the world of wellness and self-care. The Victorians were some of the first to link sleep with notions of health, personal discipline, and restoration, and these ideas are central to today's wellness culture. The modern emphasis on self-care rituals, which includes things like calming bedtime routines, herbal teas, and mindfulness practices, echoes Victorian approaches to sleep. While the tools and methods may be more advanced today, the underlying principles of relaxation, mental preparation, and cultivating a peaceful sleep environment were first developed during the Victorian era. Of course, we also see the continued influence of Victorian sleep culture in literature and art. While the supernatural associations with sleep are no longer as prominent, the themes of sleep as a metaphor for death, transformation, and psychological exploration continue to appear in modern works. Writers, filmmakers, and artists today still draw from the complex imagery and symbolism that the Victorians explored through their works. Whether it's the exploration of sleep and dreams in films like Inception or in books that delve into the unconscious, the Victorian themes surrounding sleep are far from being forgotten. As we wrap up this journey through the Victorian era sleep culture, we can see how their beliefs about rest and its connection to health, morality, and the supernatural continue to influence our modern understanding of sleep today. While we may no longer believe that the direction of our bed affects our dreams, or that sleep is a portal to the afterlife, the Victorians' holistic approach to sleep as a necessary and transformative process continues to resonate with us. From sleep hygiene to the psychological importance of rest, their contributions to the field of sleep and its impact on our lives remain relevant, proving that the pursuit of restful sleep, in all its forms, truly is timeless. Now, as you settle in for your own night's rest, take a moment to reflect on how much of what we do today in our own sleep routines has been shaped by centuries of thought, ritual, and belief. Sleep, in many ways, is still a journey, a process of both body and mind that transcends mere physical rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.